The Cold War was a period of global geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies, which lasted from 1947 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The term Cold War is used because there was no direct fighting between the two. The Cold War was expressed through technological rivalries such as the space race, espionage, propaganda campaigns, embargoes, and sports diplomacy. U.S. involvement in regime change during the Cold War included support for anti-communist and right-wing dictatorships and uprisings, while Soviet involvement included the funding of left-wing parties, wars of independence, and dictatorships. The roots of the Cold War can be traced to diplomatic and military tensions preceding World War II. The 1917 Russian Revolution and the subsequent Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where Soviet Russia ceded vast territories to Germany, deepened distrust among the Western Allies. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, disagreements about the future of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, became central. In 1961, Soviet allied East Germany constructed the Berlin Wall to prevent the citizens of East Berlin from fleeing to West Berlin, at the time part of the United States allied West Germany. Major crises of this phase included the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949, the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1945 to 1949, the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and the Vietnam War of 1955 to 1975. Both superpowers competed for influence in Latin America and the Middle East and the decolonizing states of Africa, Asia, and Oceania. The fall of the Iron Curtain after the Pan-European picnic and the revolutions of 1989, which represented a peaceful revolutionary wave with the exception of the Romanian Revolution and the Afghan Civil War, 1989 to 1992, overthrew almost all of the Marxist-Leninist regimes of the Eastern Bloc. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself lost control in the country and was banned following the 1991 Soviet coup attempt that August. This in turn led to the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991 and the collapse of the communist governments across much of Africa and Asia. The Russian Federation became the Soviet Union's successor state, while many of the other republics emerged as fully independent post-Soviet states. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower, containment of Russia. The Cold War shook the foundation of the world as it was the first time that the large-scale nuclear warfare became a truly realistic threat. Spanning approximately 45 years between 1947 and 1991, where no direct battles were fought, the Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. By deeply delving into the most critical events of the dispute, historians can develop a better understanding of the Cold War's extensive conflict. At the end of World War II, the majority of American leadership was in agreement that the most viable approach against the political and militaristic expansion of the Soviet Union was to implement a containment strategy that would help keep the Soviet expansion in check and protect Western democratic values. American diplomat George Kennan described this strategy as a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the United States there can be no permanent modus vivendi agreement between parties that disagree, concluding that America had only one option to proceed: long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russia's expansive tendencies. In 1947, President Harry Truman made the containment of the Soviet Union a top priority, laying the groundwork for the Cold War by introducing domestic policies that centered on undermining communism in the United States. Such action helped set the tone for the next 4 decades of the United States foreign policy. arms race between the United States and Russia under the umbrella goal of containing Soviet Russia's military capacity, the United States began manufacturing armaments at an excessive rate, rationalizing the production of these arms as necessary to ward off potential conflict. American officials recommended that the United States develop and deploy atomic weapons in an effort to keep Soviet doctrines and policies from expanding unchecked throughout Europe and the world, and to highlight the Soviets that there would be desired consequences if they continued their expansion policies. The continued promise of mutually assured destruction by nuclear weapons and the containment of Soviet-supported communist political movements outside the Soviet Union. Not only were small arms, aircraft ships, and land-based military vehicles being produced in mass, the containment and arms race related policies employed by the U.S. also jump-started a nuclear arms race as the Soviet Union and the U.S. tried to outdo one another by creating more powerful and increasingly sophisticated nuclear weapons. The arms race culminated in an effort to develop nuclear weapons similar to the atom bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which brought a violent end to World War II. The Soviet Union recognized the immense military value of having atomic weapons and went on to develop their own atomic bombs in 1949. To maintain their perceived superiority and suppress Soviet attempts at becoming a global leader, the United States began production of an even more devastating weapon, the hydrogen bomb. Development of the hydrogen bomb. The development of the hydrogen bomb is a widely discussed topic, as there were many conflicting spheres of influence involved with its production within the political, social, and scientific communities. Some scientists, like Edward Teller, were proponents of the production of a superbomb, while others were extremely opposed to the idea. While anti-communist tensions were at a moderate baseline in the early years of the Cold War, the period of time encompassing the race to develop a functional hydrogen bomb set the precedent for the rising tensions of the Cold War as it escalated throughout the 20th century. The first successful detonation of an American-made hydrogen device occurred on November 1st, 1952, in the Pacific region of the Inahuac Atoll in the Marshall Islands. This test involved the deployment of 10.4 megaton apparatus nicknamed Mike, and the resulting explosion was a visible example of just how justified the rising level of public fear and anxiety towards hydrogen weapons had been. The blast decimated nearby islands, leaving behind a crater more than a mile wide and creating a virulent mushroom cloud that was an approximate 100 miles wide and 25 miles high. Following this test, the Soviet Union then rushed to develop hydrogen bomb technology. With the implementation of the hydrogen bomb, the Cold War was in full swing, as the American and Soviet governments, along with their respective citizens, became entirely fixated on the growing threat of the thermonuclear conflict. Space exploration. The Cold War was also resulted in a technological competition between the Soviets and the U.S. as the two nations vied against one another to achieve space supremacy. On October 4th, 1957, this space race began when a Soviet satellite named Sputnik was launched into orbit using an intercontinental ballistic missile. The launch of Sputnik represented the ever-growing power of the Soviet Union and highlighted that the U.S. was starting to fall behind in the technology-driven space race. Additionally, Sputnik showcased the power of Soviet missiles, which had effectively demonstrated the capability of delivering nuclear payloads into orbit and possibly onto American soil. In response, the United States Army launched Explorer 1 into space on January 1st, 1958. This satellite was designed by scientist Wernher von Braun a pioneer in modern rocket science, and it led to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA, by President Eisenhower. Even with this launch of the American satellite, the Soviets remained in the lead, managing to launch the first manned space mission in April 1961. 8 years later, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the surface of the moon, claiming American victory in the space race. The space race highlights a period of the Cold War where both the Soviet Union and the U.S. aimed to boost the morale of their citizens by showcasing their technological innovations.
And and I was racing the Grim Reaper because these were older men, and their lives were in the twilight years, and so I had to really work fast and hard to get. I did 120 interviews. To get the interviews I needed to tell the story, to get a narrative, to tell the story. I believe, as you know, in writing history in narrative form, because I think you have, and I believe in catching that segment, that segment of history, which is in men's minds.
Built in 1961, the Berlin Wall was designated by a communist government of the German Democratic Republic as a means of curtailing the flow of East German migrants into democratic West Germany. This almost 100-mile-long fortified line of watchtowers, concrete barricades, and trenches effectively split Berlin in two. The Berlin Wall became a potential symbol of the Iron Curtain, the ideological and physical divide that separated the democratic West from the communist East during the Cold War. Though, as the 1960s came to a close, communist power began its decline, as during this time the United States began accelerating towards becoming the world's first completely unparalleled superpower. When President Richard Nixon took office in 1969, the American approach to international relations began to switch in favor of diplomacy. For instance, the United States went on to establish diplomatic relations with Communist China. The United States also drafted and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviets in 1972 and 1979, a treaty that had placed limitations on the manufacture of nuclear weapons by both parties, partially eliminating the perceived threat of global thermonuclear warfare. The Cold War had significant impact on popular culture as it provided a backdrop for a variety of works of art, literature, and film. The Cold War had a profound effect on global trade and commerce. The U.S.-Soviet rivalry led to the creation of two distinct economic blocs, with each side attempting to outcompete the other in terms of production and exports. The end of the Cold War brought about a new world order, the bipolar system of the Cold War, which had been characterized by the two superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union, was replaced by a multipolar system with the emergence of new powers such as China, India, and Brazil. The Cold War had a profound impact on the global nuclear arms situation. In the decades since the end of the Cold War, the number of nuclear weapons in the world has decreased significantly. This is largely due to the efforts of the United States and the Soviet Union to reduce their stockpiles of nuclear weapons.